Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to the Near Memo with Mike Blumenthal and me, Greg Sterling. And today we're going to be talking about some preliminary insights that we have from some user research that we're doing into how consumers are interacting with local AI overviews or AI overviews that appear for local search queries. And this is in a particular vertical, which we're not going to disclose at this moment because it's right now proprietary and it's very preliminary, but very interesting early anecdotal information. We're also going to be talking about the theory that ChatGPT is now using the Google index rather than Bing for its web search based on some research and a little bit of speculation. And then finally, Google announced now that it has 500 million local guides, which is a major jump from, I think, their last public number, which a couple of years ago was something like 150 million. So that's a really massive number of people that are supporting Google's local graph. And what does that mean? And what do we think about it in the context of sort of what's happening in the larger marketplace? Before we get into it, I want to thank GatherUp, our sponsor, for supporting this podcast, gatherup.com. Thanks very much. And with that, Mike, why don't you talk about what you're seeing?
Sure. So as most people know, we do consumer behavior research, UX research, primarily around how consumers interact with Google. We've done it in a number of verticals: storage, restaurants, hotels,
Healthcare.
Healthcare, and employment lawyers and others. And we're starting a new project. And as part of that, we always test 10 or 20 user interactions to make sure that we're prompting correctly and that users are interacting in a way that is trackable, et cetera. So in this, we've started a new test. And in that, as you would expect, and it's a local query, and we're seeing an increasing number of AIOs in the local queries. Estimates from other research, 40, 50%, I don't think are inaccurate based on our small user sample. We'll know more in the future. But what's interesting to me is, at least anecdotally, and in this vertical and in local, a lot of caveats, what we see with AIOs is they are used for confirmation by the user. In other words, when a user puts in a search phrase, they're not quite sure what the search phrase is. And one of the early results is an AIO, might be after the ads, but it's in position 1 or 2, maybe 3. Users do scan the summary and then frequently click the more info to confirm that their search is about the right topic. And then they proceed to scan down the rest of the page, at least partway down the rest of the page, until they see things they're looking for. And I just find it interesting that, at least in local at this point, AIOs are reducing the number of considerations people have to make, reducing the number of keyword searches that they have to go through to get the information they're looking for. And so this, to some extent, confirms your research as to why people like them, because they're helping them not have to work harder. And I think that's an important thing. And I think Google understands that. So I am modestly optimistic that, at least in local, the impact of AIOs is going to be confirming and beneficial, and not in any way reduce client success in Google.
Well, one of the things, so quick question for you. I have my own cluster of these to dive into, which I haven't yet. So these are, we're watching videos of people actually doing searches and narrating those searches. So that's what this is. It's not clickstream data. And they give us insight into what their thinking is, because they speak about the different elements on the page or why they're doing something. But is this primarily desktop and mobile? What do you remember?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the AIOs were primarily desktop. The cases, again, it's not a huge number of cases. And as we build out a full data set, we'll have a better story, but mostly desktop in the ones that I think where I'm seeing this behavior.
So it's very different, it seems, in local than what's going on in kind of general informational queries, where people are looking for, how many times can I take aspirin in a day or something like that, where there's a question that can be answered in the AI overview and somebody doesn't need to click through to a website. But ultimately,
what do you mean? You can't just go to Forbes and get that answer?
Well, but you probably can. The 10 best aspirin companies 2025.
Right.
But I think in local, ultimately, people are looking for a business or multiple businesses that they can then query about pricing or make a decision. These are all about transactions ultimately. And so the AI overview doesn't really help them. I mean, there is the sort of sources module where sometimes there are individual businesses that appear and you could click through on that. But ultimately there's going to be some sort of referral to a local business. It's a
Which
different.
has always been the case in local. We've
Right.
been zero click in local forever. And zero click isn't an issue in local as long as you get the lead. And so I don't think it's going to dramatically change the number of people who go to the website in local, the number of people who click to call from Google or use the phone number from Google, make the decision right there. I don't think that's going to change. On our last legal research, which was employment law, we saw 55% of the users actually going into organic and 45%, well, it was 53 and 42 or something in local, and the balance using ads, except when local service ads were present, fulfills, in at least in the legal space, fulfills so many user needs. A big besides reviews and ratings, there's pictures, and most importantly, years in business. When people are looking at lawyers, they seem very impressed by some lawyer that's been there for 48 years.
Well, that's a proxy for quality for people, or credibility or reliability or what have you.
And local service ads delivers that whole package:
Right.
pictures, ratings, reviews, and years in business, much more so than local.
Right. It's really interesting because uh, I was seeing a lot of AIOs in local for a time, and lately I have not been. I have not been noticing them as much. I'm seeing the pack and and service ads in particular categories and
I think
not legal service ads, but local service ads. You're talking about legal, but local service ads are a kind of tactic to deal with AI overviews if you're trying to get visibility. And this is part of Google's strategy is to on some level compel people to buy ads because they have guaranteed visibility in a way. Local LSAs have all of these other attributes that you spoke about, which make them effective, chief among which is that people often don't recognize their ads, or they look different enough that the ad label is less significant for people.
so. Speaking of that, I mean, one of the things I'm seeing is, two local service ads, two regular ads, and then an ad in the pack also. So this increased monetization is going on. A lot of the ads I'm seeing are using location assets, so they
Right.
look like
They
a
flag a
local.
location. Yeah.
They flag a location, have reviews and ratings. And because of the pack now including a sponsored ad and Google's history of sort of gray activity around identifying sponsored ads, I'm seeing, we've seen this before, some confusion as to whether local is paid or free by people. And I find that fascinating behavior as well. That
Right.
in local, there'll be one sponsored ad, it'll be properly labeled, and three non free ads. In regular ones, like LSAs, there'll be one that's labeled sponsored and two or three that aren't, but
Right.
are.
It's intentionally confusing. It's designed to be confusing so that the line between organic and paid is
Right.
blurred.
Is blurred.
It's a
That's
bad
correct.
it's a bad faith sort of behavior. It's interesting in the past in past user testing. I've noticed, sort of again similarly anecdotal. I've noticed that some people, it's a minority, but there are some people who think the entire pack module is an ad. There have been people that think that so it just reflects this confusion that people have over what's an ad or what's not an ad. And one of the reasons why, at least in the past, LSAs have been so effective beyond their placement and beyond these
But they're
elements, which are
effective
set
because Google includes the information that users are
right.
looking
It
for.
looks like organic information, and people don't recognize that it's an ad. Now, in this particular context, even if the ad labeling were more prominent, it might not deter people who instinctively, the majority of whom instinctively
And
react against
anecdotally, I
ads.
saw that behavior again where people said,
Yeah.
"Oh, I don't normally use ads, but this ad's incredibly targeted to what I need: pictures, ratings,
Validating
validating."
Google's statements that ads are useful content. All right.
Yeah, well, they can make it useful by detracting from usefulness of every other content, right?
Useful for them, useful for Google in
Where's the
particular.
FTC when we need them? Go figure.
They're out to lunch now. Lena Khan has left the building.
There you have it.
I feel compelled to make an editorial comment, which is the click to cancel initiative that was initiated under
I figured you would when I brought that up.
Khan.
I was setting
Yes,
you up, Greg.
yes. This is just has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but I can't help myself. So there was a click to cancel initiative that the FTC was pursuing, where they were trying to make it equally easy to cancel subscriptions as to enroll in them. So if you had a sort of a easy one-click sign up process, you needed to have something comparable to allow people to get out of the subscription, because a lot of publishers and a lot of companies rely on inertia, rely on consumer lack of consumer awareness or laziness to, and auto renew people, and have a lot of dubious behaviors around that, creating all kinds of friction to canceling. And a judge just struck that down at the behest of corporate interests that were unhappy with that for obvious reasons. And the it was an appellate court, and the appeals court, I forget which circuit, but the appeals court said very self-consciously, we are not condoning consumer deception when we do this. This is about regulatory overreach, with nudge nudge, wink wink. So it's
Disappointing at best.
Yes, disappointing. But anyway, okay, moving on to our real conversation here. There was an interesting blog post that was pointed out. Let me see. Let me find it here. Bear with me for a moment. Okay, there was an interesting blog post that Ayeda Solis pointed out on LinkedIn by a French SEO, Alexis Rilko, I'm probably mispronouncing that, who made the argument based on what looked like a non-exhaustive series of tests, did a bunch of tests and compared things. But what he argues is that ChatGPT is likely now using the Google search index instead of Bing. And the way he did that is, he did some technical stuff, but basically he compared results for the same queries on ChatGPT and Google and found much more similarity on ChatGPT and Google than he did with ChatGPT and Bing. He said there was a 30% overlap with Bing results, but a 90% overlap with Google, suggesting that Google's index is now being used by ChatGPT. And he points this out visually with different examples, and it's pretty provocative to think about and to think about the implications. Google and ChatGPT just did a Google Cloud deal where ChatGPT is going to be using some of Google Cloud's compute for its own purposes. And OpenAI, the parent of ChatGPT, has been kind of backing away from its relationship with Microsoft in incremental ways. So it's not implausible that what he says is true. But what struck me about it that was interesting was, what are the implications for local? And there is a distinction between Google's main search index and its local graph or local index. I have less insight into that than maybe you do, Mike, but there is a distinction between those two things. But if Google were to, let's assume that what Rilko is saying is accurate, if Google were to give over its local graph to ChatGPT, that would eliminate Google's principal advantage in the AI kind of world now, beyond its search and all its distribution.
One other consideration in this is that I believe in Europe, through DMA agreement, that Google is making their index available for a fee in Europe.
Yes.
And it could be that ChatGPT is actually paying in Europe and may not have the same data in the United States. I don't know.
Okay, so that's an excellent point, because this is a European SEO and this is a European context. So you may be right that I am seeing something very different. And I did some informal testing after reading this and did not see the NOT SEE as opposed to NAZI, did not see the digress Elon Musk, Grok, et cetera, et cetera.
I see.
Yeah. But
totally over my head.
Yeah. All right.
That's not hard these days. It was a pun.
It was a pun that was really unintentional and didn't work.
Okay.
Nonetheless, what you're saying may be true. I did not see these overlapping results that he was talking about in local, which may be a function of the distinction between the local graph and the main search index, and it may be a North America European distinction also. But it would be very hard for me to believe that Google would willingly give over its local graph, its local index, to a competitor, a direct competitor who is very threatening to Google.
Yeah, and it may be that we've talked in the past about how local is one of Google's primary moats.
It is the moat in my view, more than products, more than the Google brand. Google has massive distribution, and this is how it's gaining share, and that is a quasi moat or a competitive advantage. It's leveraging its various assets, Android, Chrome, Search,
Maps.
Workspace, Maps, to push Gemini on people. But local really is the major asset that it has, that is allows it to differentiate. And the survey work that I've done and that we shared in one of our office hours last month shows that it is an area of weakness for ChatGPT. And what people typically do after they do a local search, 2/3 of people have done a local search on ChatGPT, although it's not a high frequency use case, is they go to Google for the information that ChatGPT doesn't really deliver, the things that they're familiar with, maps and directions and contact details and reviews in particular.
I'll
So
do
that's
something similar with Apple Maps. It's like if I don't have complete confidence in a location or a business, I'll go to Google, find a business, get the address, and then use Apple Maps to get there. So I do something very similar, even though it's different use case. But
yeah.
I,
I have a very quick anecdotal sort of digression that illustrates sort of how my behavior is changing and true for other people. I wrote this up on LinkedIn. Got a new used car, replaced an old used car that was totaled in an accident while parked on the street. Got a 2022 Bolt EV to replace our 2019 Bolt, and I had to get in. I added it to Geico. They wanted to charge me some outrageous amount, so I did this whole thing with ChatGPT where I was interacting with it about coverages, and then I asked it, are there other carriers that are ethical, don't have consumer complaints, and are well reviewed, that blah blah blah. It
and so
surfaced a bunch.
ChatGPT said ethical, no, but no consumer complaints.
No,
Yeah.
no, no. Yes, I know it's hard to believe, but it did identify a bunch of companies. It initially identified companies, and then when I caveated the prompt, it gave me different companies, and it gave me a company I had never heard of. I mean, I've lived in California all my life. This company called Wawanesa Insurance, I had never heard of it, and I now have the car insured with that company. And in fact, they did deliver a better rate quote than for Geico. But the point is that I used Google at the very end of the process. So I did all this interaction with ChatGPT, took about an hour. I asked a whole bunch of different questions about different things. I did not go to Google. I did try one of the insurance marketplaces, one of the lead gen marketplaces, Insurify. Terrible experience. But after I'd gotten the name of this company and satisfied myself that it was somebody I wanted to contact, I did a quote through their website. I did a brand search, went to their website, did a quote, got the quote, talked to them on the phone, and concluded the deal. All of this took about an hour or an hour and a half, totally collapsed the funnel. In the past, I would have done multiple searches, gone to multiple websites, probably over a period of days. It would have been an incredibly inefficient process. And this was very streamlined and illustrates the marginalization of Google, the collapse of the funnel, and the way in which, just the process that I went through with ChatGPT was just much more helpful than doing a bunch of independent queries on Google, even with AI overviews. So I just wanted to give that little anecdotal
And explains
example.
why, not to have another sidetrack here, but explains why ChatGPT and Perplexity both are bringing out their own browsers, because they want to
Right.
know what you do when you leave ChatGPT so that they can then prioritize their
Those things.
data, those things. And it makes a lot of sense that they'd want their own browsers. I trust them even less than I trust Google with my data. So far, I've been willing to share a lot of it with ChatGPT just for the experience, but I'm going to leave my browsing primarily on Safari.
Well, and another relevant point here is that when I got on the phone, ultimately, so I got the quote through the Wawanesa website, and then it forced me to call somebody to complete it. I
And
couldn't
they said,
complete.
"Oh, Greg, oh, we see you've been looking at us, and I
No,
see I have your phone number."
just the opposite. Just the opposite. So that the person that I spoke to, who was very nice and took me through this whole process, did not ask ever, how did you discover us? How did you find us? They will have no idea that I use ChatGPT to get to them. Absolutely zero idea, which is an illustration of the problem that many local businesses are going to have. I mean, there's always been an attribution problem, and it's just going to get worse. And people have to ask. They have to ask, how did you find us? Can I ask because I've lived in California for many, 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 many decades, never saw an ad for that company, never knew about that company. And here it was on ChatGPT when I asked very specific queries about, here's my situation, I'm looking for this kind of company, and it showed up. And it said no consumer complaints, no, very few consumer complaints, well reviewed, and very competitive price wise. It did not show me any of the sources for that information. There were no links. There were
You could
no
have asked
source
for them.
references.
We'll
I
follow
did
up with you in a year and see what
I
your
did
review
ask
is.
for them. I did ask for them, and it was very interesting. I said, "Where did you get this information?" And I'm just speaking off the top of my head, so I don't remember everything. But it looked at the California Department of Insurance website for complaints. It looked at multiple things. I mean, there were like 10+ sources in there. It looked at the BBB website. It looked at some insurance marketplace data. It looked at Nerd Wallet. It gave me the whole list when I asked for it, and there were a bunch of things in there. And so there's just a number of lessons in here about consumer behavior, again, anecdotally, and for B2B understanding or B2B2C understanding of attribution. All right, that was a long digression. So now let's talk about the idea that Google now has, or not the idea, the fact, according to Google, that it now has 500 million people locally who it says are local guides that are contributing data, reviews, and other things, images to,
Photos, store
yeah,
openings,
right, hours, all of this
road
stuff.
corrections,
Yeah.
massive
We
data source.
the last public number that I was aware of was 150 million. And in 2021, Sochi put out some research that showed that not 2/3, but approaching 2/3 of reviews are contributed by local guides. And local guides are the source of much of the information that people are seeing on, Google Local, Google Maps. It's a really, really big deal. And we just talked about this, but we've talked a lot about Google's moat around local. This local data is a major asset. I would even argue that more than the data itself, this group of quote unquote volunteers is the local asset that Google has that it
Yeah, we
cannot be
don't know how
replicated.
active they are, but 500 million puts the mail list alone at roughly half of the known monthly users of Google Maps. And so they have a direct connection with a vast number of their users. And we do know that Google said this a couple weeks ago that 50% of all new store openings are identified by local guides prior to them learning about it someplace else. IRS, MasterCard, Data, Axel, wherever Google gets their data, which I find fascinating, that 50% of openings. And it speaks to how they're able to keep a fresh data set, how they're able to fix roads, for example, and prioritize fixes of roads, and how they're able to get 1 billion reviews every year, close to 1 billion, of
Right. I
which
mean,
only 25% are fake.
well, I mean, in the beginning, as you
That
know
was
from
air
being
quotes for those of you who are listening.
yes, in the beginning, as you know from being around for a very, very long time, as I have been, Google was licensing data, was getting data from third party publishers and data aggregators. And this was in the era of NAP consistency when that was a big ranking factor and you had to have your data all over the place and it had to be
Just for a
entirely
little
consistent.
historical aside, the reason that it was so important was that prior to 2012, with the advent of the knowledge graph, there was no canonical local record. They would
Right.
reconstitute the local listing every 6 weeks. They would rebuild the world from available
Which
data
is
sources.
which is why the data you'd have good data and then it would be overwritten by bad data.
Exactly. And so the reason for NAP consistency prior to 2012 was that Google's technology was unsophisticated or based on their web scraping
Their methodology for,
methodology.
yeah.
And it created monster listings. Sometimes it would merge two businesses that were similar and close to each other. Sometimes it would add crazy stuff to your business. So the reason that it was considered important back then was this. Now with a fixed data record, which has a known stable base data, it's much harder to get these Frankenstein listings. So these third rate directories are much less important.
Right. And hence
Sorry
the
for the
decline. No,
digression.
no, 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 that's directly relevant. I mean, many people don't know that information. And so hence the decline of citations as a ranking factor. Although citations have new life because of the sort of,
Back to the
the,
local guides. I mean, this
yes,
is a huge asset that Google has that no
it's
other
unbelievable.
company
Nobody
has.
has this asset. And it's ironic that in the age of machine learning and AI and all of this technology that everybody is sort of touting, the real asset is a bunch of humans around the world who give their time to Google. And they do that because of the gamification largely that Google has
And there's a
implemented.
pyramid of these humans. The ones that are most into it become product experts in the Google forums. So there's a Maps forum where people help Google fix egregious problems in Maps. There's a Google business profile forum where people help them fix these data. So the real egregious problems sort of float up to the top there.
That's
And
a user calling with a
these
problem right
volunteers,
now.
these volunteers assist in this. So it's a Joel Headley once told me that in 2008, 2010, 2012, they were getting people avidly correcting maps, sending Google emails, and they didn't know what to do with it. So they opened it up in that time frame to suggestions, and they get 20 million corrections a day or more now. And then I think it was 2015 they created local guides, or 2014
Something like
after Google
2015, I think.
Plus went away. They created
Yep.
local guides. It's one of the contributors to Google's dominance in the review arena
It's
was that sort of whole
Well, local
cycle
guides.
of
Well,
local guides.
local guides were modeled on the Yelp Elite Squad, although at a scale unimaginable compared to Yelp.
Worldwide scale. That's right.
Yeah, and it's really a genius. I mean, it was copied from Yelp, but it was the execution, I guess, is what we have to praise, not the idea itself. It's a just a unfathomable success story for Google, and as you point out, it bleeds into these other areas. It's become a support pipeline for Google as well. In addition to a crowdsourced data tool, it's become this support tool. And I
Propaganda avenue where they can then pitch all these people on the poor, sad Google is being regulated and we need your
yeah,
support to avoid that
right.
regulation.
So what would be exactly what would be really interesting, which we can't do in real time here, is to put some sort of monetary value on local guides as an asset. It's like how much money is Google saving, or revenue is indirectly influenced by local guides. Were Google not the main review destination in local, they would have less traffic, and that would mean less ad clicks and revenue, as
I
just one
don't know. I
small
do know
example.
that, I have a number of people who I cooperate with who are high level local guides. I am a 7, almost an 8, by the way, a couple points away from being a 8 level local guide.
See, even you have been seduced by the gamification.
Oh, yeah. I figured out the easiest way to get points and I just do it. But the optimization, personal optimization on that front. But I frequently work with people when I'm trying to solve businesses' issues in the forum. I often will fall back on the cohort of people who are local guides together with me, and we will, through the local guide system, try to get a listing merged or a review taken down.
And we know that if you are a high ranking local guide, whatever it is, 8, 9, 10, and you make a request or you make a change, Google will honor that because it trusts people at that level.
In fact, we wrote that article at Near Media
Right.
where what it took to get a phone number changed wasn't that much. And it was a couple of high level local guides, and Google changed a phone number. So there you go.
Well, and
There's our
Google
spam
and
tip of the week.
Right. And Google, I mean, in Google's defense, they vet these people over time, meaning they watch them, they reward them and then bring them into the circle of trust. And so give them the ability to make those changes. Now, we don't have Curtis Boyd here, but what he would tell you is that the local guide network, perhaps at a lower level of trust, has been infiltrated by spammers and fraudsters and people who are seeking to manipulate the system. The penetration is probably not massive, but it's probably a microcosm of the percentage of fake reviews in the world, which is somewhere, on Google, in certain categories, it's much more, but overall in the aggregate, it's something like 11%, or I forget what the latest number was. So you probably have about an equivalent number of local guides.
Any
which
algorithmic system of measurement and trust can be gamed, and people
Right.
game it for gain. I mean, there are a number of people who do review blackmail. We're seeing increasing reports of that. There are a number of people who do review spam. Number of people who do black hat stuff via this. So certainly it's being gamed. And Google doesn't. If you've ever tried to get a local guide taken down, unlike a review, which they'll take down with some consistency when it's really egregious, getting a local guide taken down is incredibly difficult. I had a local guide who was named something like fuck enough or something. I can't remember exactly, but it had the word fuck in their local guide name.
Profile.
I could not get this local guide taken down. I mean, I did ultimately, but it took me 6 months, and I had to call on personal favors to get somebody to look at it beyond the access I had as a product expert.
Yes, I'd like to say I'm only a 5, local guide level 5, and I have steadfastly resisted Google's attempts to manipulate me with rewards and points and level upgrades. So I will not be seduced by the manipulations of their gamification system. So that's my
likely story. You're already a 5, so just a question of being a 6.
No, I would, but that was that. There's a longer story there. That was about sort of just the past. That's the past. And that was before I realized Google was a bad actor in most cases, not in all, but in most cases. Okay. So with that, we bring another episode to conclusion. Lots of advice tidbits in here for local marketers. We will be doing another office hours this month. Look for that announcement for our all access members. And if you're not an all access member, please consider subscribing. You get our fantastic newsletter, of course, that I produce with great insights and input from Mike and David, and access to our other content. So think about that. And thanks again to Gather Up, our sponsor, for supporting this podcast. And we will see you next week, hopefully.